Hello, and welcome to Ratlucht, an Icelandic word meaning beacon or guiding light. This channel is for the purpose of looking at gospel doctrines and practices from a larger framework and looking at, in particular, how academic and other information that we have available to us today can inform our practices and understanding of the gospel. To that end, I would like to take a look at our first topic for this channel, which is things as they really are. Jacob 4:13 reads in part, "Behold, my brethren, he that prophesieth, let him prophesy unto the understanding of men," meaning we should look at it in our own rationale and in an explanation that makes sense to us. "For the Spirit speaketh truth and lieth not, wherefore it speaketh of things as they really are, and of things as they really will be. Wherefore these things are manifested unto us plainly for the salvation of our souls." So the Spirit speaketh the truth, and it defines the truth as things as they really are. Now, why is it important that we know things as they really are? Perhaps one example may be a cautionary tale from the book of Ether. At this point in the book of Ether, chapter 15, we have major battles going on between Coriantumr and Shiz, and we're kind of approaching that final battle. At this point in the war, Coriantumr says the following in verses 1 through 3. Put it this way so you can see it too. "And it came to pass when Coriantumr had recovered of his wounds, he began to remember the words which Ether had spoken to him. And he saw that there had been slain by the sword already nearly 2 millions of his people, and he began to sorrow in his heart. Yea, there had been slain 2 millions of mighty men, and also their wives and their children. And he began to repent of the evil which he had done." And now this is the important part. "He began to remember the words which had been spoken by the mouth of all the prophets, and he saw them that they were fulfilled thus far, every whit. And what is the consequence? And his soul mourned and refused to be comforted." Now, at this point, he realizes, okay, things as they really are. I've been told how things really are. I've been ignoring them. I've been in denial, and I see that they are coming to pass, and this is unfortunate because they were negative things. They were warnings, right? So he does try to make amends. It doesn't work. He tries again over the next several years to make amends. And it says in verse 9 that he fails, and this is why he fails. "But behold, the Spirit of the Lord had ceased striving with them, and Satan had full power over the hearts of the people. For they were given up into the hardness of their hearts and the blindness of their minds, that they might be destroyed. Wherefore they went again to battle." And we see that if we procrastinate seeing things as they really are for too long, and we procrastinate, we deny that reality for too long, it affects not only us, but civilization, and there's only so much we can do to backpedal, just as Coriantumr could only backpedal so much from his actions on society as a whole. So that's perhaps a more cautionary tale as to why we do need to understand things as they really are. Now, we can represent things as they really are as a box. And in this box, at the top, we can label it reality, or things as they really are, the truth, whatever we want to call it up here, but things as they really are. And as we look at things as they really are, one of the ways in which we can examine and look at all of this is to ask if there is a connection between the spiritual things that we learn and the secular things that we learn. Now, of course, this falls into two categories. There is the things that are connected spiritually and secularly, and there are things that are not connected. And we can look at this in the scriptures. For example, the things that are connected spiritually and secularly, we can see in the little diagram over here. Doctrine and Covenants 29:34 says, "Wherefore verily I say unto you that all things unto me are spiritual, and not at any time have I given unto a law which was temporal." And then later in verse 35, "For my commandments are spiritual, they are not natural nor temporal, neither carnal nor sensual." We can see a reference to this idea that there is the connection between the two also in Doctrine and Covenants 27:13, which says towards the end, "I will gather together in one all things, both which are in heaven and which are on the earth." And again, we see that combination, kind of all truth in one. It maybe is a little bit more clear even in the Book of Mormon. In 2 Nephi 2, verse 11, our famous verse about opposition, says in the second half of the verse, "Wherefore all things must need be a compound in one. Wherefore if it should be one body, it must needs remain as dead, having no life, neither death, nor corruption, nor incorruption, happiness, nor misery, neither sense, nor insensibility." So again, we see that combination that not everything is homogeneous, it's not all the same, but it is all connected and all intertwined in one. And then, of course, my last reference here, in Alma 30, verse 41 says, "Behold, I have all things as a testimony that these things are true, and ye also have all things as a testimony unto you that they are true." This, of course, is when he assumes that everything testifies that there is a God. So we do know, based on these scriptures, that there are lots of things that are secular and spiritual that are intertwined, where one informs the other because they're both true and they have this connection. So that's this first column here. There are, however, a couple things that are not. And for this one, these are things that obviously don't fit in line with the truth. So there's not going to be a connection. And just as a sample reference for you, if we look at Alma 115, it says, it's talking about another Antichrist, Nehor, and specifically why he is sentenced to death. It says, "There he was caused, or rather did acknowledge between the heavens and the earth, that what he had taught to the people was contrary to the word of God, and there he suffered an ignominious death." And we have other scriptures, of course, that reference false doctrines, false teachings, things that are incompatible with reality. And so that's kind of the second column here. There is no connection because they're not true. And so the Spirit has all things that are true, and anything secular, any secular teaching that is also true is going to have a spiritual connection, and any secular teaching that is not true is not going to have a spiritual connection or a component. And so we can see these two columns here. Now, at this point, I would like to take advantage of kind of a secular teaching that we might not think of as being super spiritual, and that is statistics. So, not to say that everything about statistics is 100% true, but one of the things that statistics does is it looks at samples of populations, and it looks at, in particular, our own ability to interpret reality and to combine with reality. So, in statistics, we're going to look at, okay, we're trying to find out what is true. So as a part of that, we are subject to our own individual interpretation. And it is important that we do that. The scriptures that support this, for example, is Moroni 7:15, which says, "For behold, my brethren, it is given unto you to judge, that you may know good from evil, and the way to judge is as plain, that you may know with a perfect knowledge as the daylight is from the dark night." So we are commanded, we are given to the faculties to judge, and we are expected to judge and figure out for ourselves which belong in which category as far as reality goes. Now, I draw the diagram here. We have, things that I think are a spiritual and secular connection in this first column, and things that I think are not connected in this second column. Now, why do I draw it this way? Because I want to overlap it with the first. And as we look as this combination goes, we see that we have things as they really are. Some things are true and connected, and some things, secular teachings, are false. And then we have our own interpretation of what is true and connected and what is false. Now, we'll see in two of those boxes that we nail it, right? We are totally in line with the things that are true and things as they really are, and our interpretation of things as they really are aligned, and things as they really are not, the false doctrines and teachings, and things that we believe really are not our interpretation, are totally in line. But these other two boxes here represent error. Now, it's important to note, either way, an error is an error, and it's going to lead us off the course, and that is something that we don't want to have occur. We could read Doctrine and Covenants 1068, or 3 Nephi 18:13, and those both give us an example of the problems that occur when we are in error. Now, from a stats perspective, each of these two errors has a different name. The first error on the top is called type 1 error. This is when we think there is a connection, but there really is not, or we've adopted some false doctrine into our lives. And the bottom is a type 2 error, which says we don't think there's a connection, but there really is, so we've rejected some truth in our lives. Now, which error is worse is the question. In stats, if we were taking a basic stats course, they would probably tell you a type 1 error on the first line is worse. Why would they say that? Because they're trying to make sure that the data that we're using, that when we have a positive result, it absolutely is a positive result and not a false positive. And as a basic rule of thumb, that is true. There are a lot of ways in which we enact this if we were going to apply that to our lives, which is to say, I'm going to compartmentalize church away from these other teachings that I have, that I'm learning, this other knowledge, and that will serve me well because I won't accidentally make a connection where there isn't a connection. However, it is a little more nuanced than that. The type 1 error and the type 2 error, which is worse, actually depends on the particular type of question you're asking. And in our case, we are asking, is there a spiritual and a secular connection on this piece of knowledge or this piece of information? Or in other words, is it true or is it not true? Now, in order to understand this and really explore that question of which error is worse, to see a connection when there isn't or to not see a connection when there is, it actually will help us to take a different direction and borrow from set theory and philosophy and look at Venn diagrams. So here we have our basic Venn diagram. We have two circles. One represents all of our secular knowledge and teachings and learnings, and the other represents spiritual knowledge and teachings and learnings. And there's an overlap, and the place where they overlap is where it's true. Now, we went back and we read Doctrine and Covenants 27:13 and 29:34 and 35, and we said anything that's spiritual or all things are spiritual unto the Lord. Anything that's true is spiritual. We can also see that in Alma 30 verse 44, which reads, in part, the scriptures are laid before thee, yea, all things denote there is a God, yea, even the earth and all things that are upon the face of it, yea, and its motion, yea, and also all the planets which do move in their regular form do witness that there is a supreme creator. So based on all of these scriptures, it seems that if it's spiritual, it's true, and if it's doctrinal, right, then it's true, and it's going to have a counterpart. It's going to connect with things as they really are, as we see them in the secular world. So based on that, there is no spiritual outside of the secular as we draw it here, which means we can redraw it as a spiritual circle inside a secular circle. Now, it's important to note that we often make a mistake here. We assume that because the spiritual circle is smaller than the secular circle, that the secular circle is somehow more important. But we have to remember that anything in the secular circle that is not in the spiritual circle is all the other teachings that are false, that are not true. Otherwise, they would be perfectly in sync as one circle. They would be the same size. So as we look at this, we can see the type 1 and type 2 errors represented in a different way. So a type 1 error, as we're looking at this, is going to be something that's existing in this spiritual circle that shouldn't be. We're going to represent it with this little triangle here. For example, the idea that there is no life after death. There might be this secular knowledge or information or data or teaching or philosophy that is out there that if we incorporate it into our spiritual realm and circle, we adopt it as true, then we are adopting a false doctrine. Now, what is the problem here? The problem here is, as we have larger and larger type 1 errors, is that our spiritual circle gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger than it should, right? But it tries to encompass all of the learning that we have, all of the secular learning that we've been exposed to in this life. Now, on the flip side, a type 2 error is going to take that original spiritual, secular circle of things as they really are, right? And it's going to make it a little smaller. And you see how as it's a little smaller, we now have these kind of star-shaped, X-shaped pieces of truth that are being left out of our spiritual realm here. So as we continue to do that, it gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and to the point that we've totally compartmentalized the spiritual aspect and we've left out a lot of truth on the other side here. So when we look at this and these two types of phenomena here, the question becomes, which is worse? Now again, an error is an error, and both are bad, and maybe at the end of the day, to a certain extent, it doesn't matter. But if we were going to pick which one was worse, then we have to look at the consequences of both of them. The type 2, which we were just looking at, error, the consequences, the risk, the consequences is that we are minimalizing spiritual truth. And we see this in Doctrine and Covenants 59:21, why that is such a problem. So the confess not his hands in all things, we can interpret as applying to this diagram here. In other words, you're leaving God out of all of this. You're leaving the spiritual, eternal aspect out of all of this stuff that we're learning. Now, the type 1 error, on the other hand, when we have the circle that's too spiritual, too big, we can have that caution of that error from 2 Nephi 28:12, which says, because of pride and because of false teachers and false doctrines, things that are not true that are slipping in here, their churches have been corrupted and their churches are lifted up because of pride, they are puffed up. Now, which of those is worse? If we're looking at the diagrams, again, we can argue that they're both bad and they're both unnecessary, and they both need to be corrected, absolutely, as we come in line to things as they really are. But I would submit that it appears, at least in this conversation, when we're looking at the connection between the spiritual and the secular, that the error is having too much of a spiritual outlook on our life in the type 1 error versus too little of a spiritual outlook in our life in the type 2 error, and that having too little of a spiritual outlook in our life is going to be more detrimental to us in the long run than having too big of a spiritual outlook in our lives and occasionally needing to root out some of those false doctrines. Further, the type 1 error, as we're looking at it, can be almost completely eliminated or severely mitigated if we take into account some other factors. So how too big is our circle going to get? We might only let slip in the occasional false doctrine as opposed to tons of false teachings and doctrines, or we might not let any false doctrines in. And the way to do that, again, is by alignment with the spirit of truth, alignment of that reality that Jacob talks about in 4:13. When we have the spirit of truth, we are able to discern whether something new fits into our circle of spirituality or not. And again, even though the Venn diagram leads us to believe that the secular is bigger and therefore maybe more important or takes priority over the spiritual, or even that on some level they're equal, we actually want to flip that thinking and remember that if we subjugate our secular learning to our spiritual learning, we will severely mitigate or almost eliminate the risk of a type 1 error. And if we're erring on type 1 instead of type 2, that means we can get rid of our risk almost entirely altogether. In order to do that, we need to look for how the secular fits into the spiritual and not the other way around, not how our spiritual can be added to our secular knowledge. And we cannot fall prey to the idea, again, that the bigger circle denotes superiority. The secular is not superior to the spiritual. The spiritual is superior to the secular. And 2nd Nephi chapter 9, I think really hits on this point when it says the following in verse 39, towards the end of verse 39. It says, remember, to be carnally minded is death, and to be spiritually minded is life eternal. So in reverse of that cautionary tale that we got before from Coriantumr, who is just thinking about the secular, just thinking about his own might and the might of his people, we see that being spiritually minded, thinking of everything through a spiritual lens, is going to get us in line with things as they really are a lot faster and with less error than making our spiritual world and our spiritual circle of knowledge too small.